Schnulap and Schniknukwa, Schlathalamkin in Squachicha, in Hoistin Mechcan, Schlatnum. First of all, I would like to express my greatest gratitude, acknowledgement, and appreciation, giving thanks to our ancestors for the unceded traditional lands of the Indigenous peoples within our provinces, within our territories, within our communities. Indigenous peoples around the world, many of which are elders, teachers, language mentors to across the country, state that we must return to the source of our existence, which is basically the relationship to our land and our language. It is an honor to be here on the land. I bring greetings to you from my homelands of the Stadtlim Hoistin community. All over the world, it is extremely important for the survival of our language and our cultures. In the aftermath of residential schools, the purpose of this presentation to share with you on this beautiful day is based on the significance of Indigenous languages. Presenting on this topic allows us to engage deeply within our thought, and it allows us to have conversations about the importance of our languages in our community, our language teachers, even across the globe, into the United States and internationally, and at a global level are doing groundbreaking work that is outstanding and which should be showcased in regards to giving hope, inspiration, demonstrating resilience of who it is that we are as Indigenous peoples. According to the research, language teaching and learning has been found to result in improved education outcomes. Improved education outcomes are essential, closing the gap for Indigenous learners for all ages. We want our lifelong learners to succeed. We want them to become employable. We want them to have careers. We want them to be able to contribute back to their communities and to society. Most of all, we want them to be able to contribute back to their own Indigenous communities and to know and to understand who they are and where they come from. We want them to know that they can be self-sufficient, sustained, while learning their languages. It has been stated that a legislation and policy will result in improved education outcomes, improved healthy outcomes, and overall well-being. Indigenous peoples around the world are restoring fluency and active use of languages through education, community, family as well, through immersion programs, education programs, family structured programs, mentorship programs, and these projects and programs have been proven effective. So it's very important for families to start to incorporate language as a part of a vital cultural continuity and fundamental part of self-determination as Indigenous peoples. So who am I? My people, amongst many Indigenous peoples across the country, are surrounded with traditional hunting, fishing, and trapping and gathering foods and resources. This was a way of life, land-based and culture-based. It is not a trend for us. It is a living, giving force. It is a part of who we are as Indigenous peoples. It is necessary for the survival of our cultures and our languages. One of the things we share with other Indigenous people around the world is our strong relationship with the land. Out of this relationship with the land, we developed a shared worldview which frames how we see the world in our place in the land as it is sacred to us. It has no filters. It is in its natural state. The land, therefore, is the glue that holds us together, the Tmiuch, Uhuamiuch, and Uhuamiuch, which are all interconnected. In each one of the words, there's a root word which stems from Tmiuch, which is the land. Tmiuch, Uhuamiuch, Uhuamiuch, which is the language the people of the land speak. The cultural ways of life are inseparable from our languages prior to colonization. Indigenous peoples' cultures, languages flourish across the landscapes of the globe. Today, there are only 7 Indigenous languages across 12 language groups currently spoken in Canada. Drastic actions are needed to be taken to offset the erosion and loss of Indigenous languages. We all have a part to support and or learn in the process of language revitalization. Residential schools were primarily responsible for interrupting the intergenerational transmission of Indigenous languages and cultural practices. Beginning in 2009, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada began proceedings to investigate the effects of residential school system. In the large part, this involved listening to survivors of the schools. We know that residential school system is the primary reason for the interruption of intergenerational transmission of Indigenous languages. Its effects are ongoing. The Commission released its report in 2015 with 94 calls to action. 4 of these calls concerned language. In response to one of these calls to action, the Government of Canada has begun to work to enact the official language legislation for Indigenous languages, co-developed with 3 Indigenous organizations. The calls to action on Indigenous languages on the TRC in 2015, pages 321 to 322, include that we call upon the federal government to acknowledge that Aboriginal rights include Aboriginal language rights, as well as to enact an Aboriginal Languages Act that incorporates the following principles. One was that we would appoint consultation with Aboriginal groups, Indigenous peoples, as Aboriginal language commissioners. The commissioner should help promote Indigenous languages and report on the adequacy of federal funding for Indigenous languages, as well as post-secondary institutions to create university and college degree diplomas in Indigenous languages, as well as enable residential school survivors and their families to change their names by residential school system by waiving any costs and or fees in regards to name changes for Indigenous languages. When we think about languages, there's also dialects. Language dialects are very, very important to understand. Language and dialects, these terms are often used interchangeably and can create some confusion, especially in BC, because most languages are made up of 2 or 3 more varieties of dialects. Dialects may vary in many ways from pronunciation, words, and grammar. But as long as a speaker of different dialects can understand each other, the dialects are considered the same language. Languages are grouped into language families. A language family includes languages that developed over time from a common parent language and transferred from generation to generation. However, the term the speaker is often used when describing the status of a language. However, the definition of a speaker is also variable. Some speakers may consider themselves to be fully fluent because they may not speak as well as their grandparents did, though other community members may see them as being fluent. Fluent speakers can speak and understand their language to a degree that they can self-identify or are identified by their community members as having the ability to converse in their language. Semi-speakers can speak and understand their language to a degree that they can self-identify, understand definitions, terms, and phrases. However, they speak less than a fluent speaker. Then we have silent speakers. Silent speakers are an important category. These silent speakers are basically someone who has good understanding of languages but does not speak it. And then we have our learners. Our learners are basically people who are in the process of learning his or her language by participating in any language learning method, program, or approach, program or class, immersion, etc. So when we think about where we're at in regards to Indigenous languages, there are 203 First Nations communities in BC and about 177 communities. And according to the last language report, there was 51.9% fluent speakers that were 65 years and older, and between the ages of 45 to 64, there was 38%, and about between the ages 25 to 44, there was 6.7%, and under 25 was 2.8% fluent speakers. So anyone in any Indigenous community is acutely aware of the passing of fluent speakers, or elders especially, and this is the main source of decrease of number of fluent speakers. So as expressed, the creation of new fluent speakers through immersion programs, community-based programs, cultural-based programs, land-based programs are very, very important. These are the areas that are critical to support and revitalize to sustain Indigenous languages. Indigenous teaching and learning are essentially based on the natural world. It has a rich language foundation from the plants, the lakes, the rivers, the mountains, the place locations and the valleys, and even those that grow from the land and slither on the earth. Everything on the land has a name. Every noun on the land has a name through the Indigenous languages. Land-based or place-based education evolved around 4 seasons, but really, essentially, there were 6 seasons, which included the winter season before freezing and the thawing season before spring. Certain things at certain times of the year were spoken during these times, during land and cultural-based activities, which evolved around the mental, spiritual, and emotional and physical development. It was all about focusing the child development with links to family and community connectedness. It was based on transfer of knowledge, intergenerational teachings from parents, elders, and or mentors to learn and to meet the cultural standards. Like so many Indigenous peoples around the globe, were taken away from their homelands and stripped from their parents, families, and communities and placed into institutional residential schools as young as 5 years old, and many others younger had endured many sufferings. These institutions existed over 150 years. One of the major impacts was a massive loss of cultures and languages. The very essence of what shapes a culture, community, and society of a people is based on a people's culture. Culture is made up of language, songs, religion, spirituality, laws, governance, a way of life of beliefs, customs, and protocols based on place, territory, and land. It is important for community members, organizations, and entities who work with Indigenous peoples to learn and understand the truth and experiences from Indigenous people's voice. The elders and traditionalists have stated many times that we must go back to the land, to the teachings, and we must embrace our languages, which is rooted in the land. For it was the separation from the land and all its entities that contributed to the language loss and cultural identity of many Indigenous peoples. When children are placed in institutions, they were separated from the traditional knowledge keepers. They were not allowed to speak their own languages, and the goal was to make them basically the likeness of European settlers, and that European worldview became a huge disconnect from Indigenous peoples to their own cultural identity. And so that created a profound confusion when they came out of schools with lots of impacts, negative impacts that impacted their cultural identity. And so there's this huge disconnection from the land, from their culture, from their community, from their heritage, from their identity. Indigenous peoples were basically silenced. And so when we think about that and the impact of where we are with our languages, Indigenous peoples have always had their own knowledge systems, which are best understood through our creation stories, songs, dances, and ceremonies, laws, and practices. We have our own ontologies. We have our own epistemologies. We have our own governing structure and system of how we governed ourselves. And that was something that needs to be brought back and acknowledged. Here we are, and it's 2022, and today we use a blend of teaching practices from this colonial world that we live in, balancing and trying to find space for Indigenous values and teachings, cultural standards for ourselves, for our families, our community, and especially for our children. So we need to start really incorporating more Indigenous teaching, learning methods that are respectful and that honor Indigenous languages. I too once was a student. I had many teachers in my life. I had awful teachers that did not reflect or honor my Indigenous unique authenticity. However, those teachers that demonstrated a strong passion to incorporate Indigenous languages or Indigenous values or perspectives into their teaching practices or how they worked with me, acknowledging my Indigenous identity, those people have left a footprint in my life. We need to be able to engage and work with Indigenous peoples that embrace the land, the language, and the culture of who they are. Because basically, we're not going anywhere. These are our homelands. This is our territory. This is our roots. This is our home base. And this is not something that we are going to leave and let go. We are part of this land. And so this shapes who we are. So we need to incorporate more language learning opportunities like land-based education programming, cultural curriculum for institutions or our governing bodies or anybody that's working with Indigenous peoples. We need to provide more place-based learning. In our culture, it is the women who are the first teachers. We have heard our elders that state that the land is our mother. She provides us with everything that we need to survive and to sustain. So just as a mother who gives birth to a child, a mother nurtures a child with value, integrity, honor, respect, protection, and guidance. If we genuinely care for our children and our community members, then we would basically start looking at how we can provide more support to gain better understanding of Indigenous peoples if we are non-Indigenous. And if we are Indigenous, we would take that responsibility to learn and relearn our cultural roots. The past is not our fault, but however, our presence and our future is. So, we can move mountains, more importantly, if we continue to start looking at how we can support, embrace, and develop greater awareness. When we think about Indigenous peoples and the women were the first teachers of the natural world, all humans heard was the heartbeat of the drum for 9 months before a child entered into this world. That heartbeat was like the blood vessels of the child. And so that rhythm is like the rhythm of the land that we carry with us for the rest of our lives. We spent the first years greatly with our mothers and our grandparents who basically guided us, and a lot of our teaching and learning was based on observation. The world around us, where we begin to see everything is connected, and overall, the level of land-based, culture-based was mending that worldview, which we can only be done from the land, language, and culture, as well as the spiritual laws and the natural laws. And, when we think about Indigenous Peoples Day, Indigenous Language Act, or the decade dedicated to Indigenous languages, the purpose of the Indigenous Language Act is used to enable and exercise Indigenous peoples' right to create legal assurance for adequate, sustainable, and long-term funding to support Indigenous leads in language, Indigenous projects to reclaim and to revitalize and maintain and strengthen Indigenous languages of Indigenous communities, and to be able to allow them to take that lead role in developing the programs that will result in a critical mass of affluent speakers in all languages. British Columbia is unique within Canada because when it comes to Indigenous languages, there are 7 distinct language families completely unrelated to each other. And within these families are 34 First Nations languages and at least 93 dialects. There's a variety of those languages. And besides those, there are 34 living languages. And 3 languages that were once spoken in BC are now sleeping. So why does diversity matter? Languages are more than just communication. Maintaining Indigenous languages is one piece of a larger struggle for social justice by Indigenous peoples in Canada, globally, as they seek to reclaim their way of life that were taken away. Indigenous languages are a part of a unique cultural heritage and identity, but more importantly, they are the rightful heritage of Indigenous peoples. Language, culture, and identity form an inseparable bond that affects the health and well-being of a people. Knowing and being able to speak one's heritage language is a human right. Language diversity also allows us to see the world through more than one lens. Indigenous languages have linguistic structures and systems that are different from any other languages. They provide insights into different ways that humans think, interact, and use their language.